And welcome to the Gaggle Challenge. And if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:07 p.m. in the cold, dark city of Budapest, as you would expect. Spring is still very far away. However, I'm very glad that everybody has joined me. And it is now, since there's only a 5 hour time difference, so it's now 4:08 p.m. on the east coast of the United States. Um, so there's a lot to discuss, and I kind of want to really start off with the real question is that are we at the beginning of the end of the war in Ukraine? I mean, can we begin to see the the light at the end of the tunnel, the final uh, outcome coming into plain sight? I'm not sure, but it is a possibility that we've moved along and are now, somewhere made a great peace on the way to the peace process. So we talked the other day about the telephone conversation between Trump and Putin, and what I think what we had agreed on was that this is a Chow from New Jersey. Always good to have Robert here from New Jersey. We used to have when we have nice chats in the old days about Governor Chris Christie and his doings, but that's now ancient history. So we have to find a new topic of conversation. There's just nothing really to talk about with Christie. And Dirth says, "I'm not so sure because the tunnel is filled with smoke." I don't disagree with that. I mean, I'm asking the question. I'm not sure what the answer is. Um, but I mean, if one looks at the sequence of events, we had the meeting in Riyadh between Marco Rubio and Sergei Lavrov, and there they had agreed upon a normalization of diplomatic relations between the United States and Russia. And then we had the disastrous meeting in the Oval Office between Trump and Zelenskyy. And then we had the meeting in Riyadh. I was at Jeddah rather, between the Ukrainians and Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz. And at that moment, they put forward that ceasefire plan, the 30-day ceasefire, um, which was a non-starter. Obviously, it was a non-starter. The Russians were never going to accept a 30-day ceasefire during which basically Ukraine could go on mobilizing, Ukraine could go on training its forces, and above all, the United States and the Europeans could go on pouring in weapons into Ukraine and thereby strengthening Ukraine for the next round of fighting. In other words, it could work on Ukraine's defensive fortifications and so on. So obviously, there was absolutely nothing in it for Russia. Russia duly said no, very politely. And however, it said, we're open to discussion, but you'd have to, make sure that you address some of our concerns. And so that was where it was last week. So then earlier this week, we had the conversation between Trump and Putin, and the Russians reiterated their position that you can't just simply have just like a ceasefire, 30-day ceasefire, whatever. You have to address the other issues like the flow of arms and the continued mobilization. But it might be possible to have a more limited ceasefire, and therefore a limited ceasefire involving attacks on one another's energy infrastructure. So there was a slight difference between the American account and the Russian account. So the Russian account talked about energy infrastructure. The American account spoke about energy and infrastructure. So that obviously a more wide ranging, but nonetheless, um, that was something that the Russians were willing to discuss, and so therefore we could move on from there. But the Russians and the Americans also agreed, that was during the Trump Putin phone conversation, to start talking about some kind of a ceasefire in the Black Sea. So that would be the next stage. I mean, we're not ready to talk about it now, but begin to discuss that a ceasefire in the Black Sea. So therefore, limited ceasefire when it comes to the attacks on energy infrastructure. Nothing new, of course, because they discussed a ban on attacks on one another's energy infrastructure last year. The negotiations were going on in Qatar for some time, but were sabotaged by the Zelensky's invasion of Kursk in August of last year. So it's going back to that, and then we're talking about the possible ceasefire in the Black Sea. All right, so that was the discussion in between Trump and Putin, and we talked about that on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday we had a discussion between Trump and Zelensky. So this is the first conversation since that disastrous meeting in the Oval Office. So at least they weren't in physical presence of each other, but nonetheless, it was they were talking, and it's quite interesting what they. This is why I'm raising the issue of whether we're coming toward the beginning of the end. Just raising that issue. Not saying that we're at the end, but raising that issue. So let's just look at what happened during that conversation between Trump and Zelensky. So remember, Trump goes along with that idea of that limited 30-day ceasefire on attacks on energy infrastructure. Then he says, yeah, we'll talk about the Black Sea. And then after the meeting, he sounds very optimistic. He sounds, yeah, we're heading towards that. So he's basically saying this is a step-by-step process. This is the way Trump sees it. It's a step-by-step process. We get, limited ceasefire here, and then another limited ceasefire there, and then we move on to a more permanent ceasefire. So that's why Trump sounded very optimistic on Tuesday. So then we have the meeting with the conversation rather with Zelensky, and here we have first of all Trump's truth. As always, he says, just completed a very good telephone call with President Zelensky of Ukraine. It lasted approximately 1 hour. So his conversation with Putin, he said, lasted about 2 hours. So it lasted approximately 1 hour. Much of the discussion was based on the call made yesterday with President Putin in order to align both Russia and Ukraine in terms of their requests and needs. So he's saying, in order to align both Russia and Ukraine, we are very much on track. See, this is again, always this optimism. We are very much on track. And I will ask Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Michael Waltz to give an accurate description of the points discussed. That statement will be put out shortly. And that, in fact, we'll come to that in a minute, the actual joint statement that they issued. And then here's Zelensky, who sent out this tweet. Said, I had a positive, very substantive and frank conversation with President of the United States, Donald Trump. I thanked him for a good and productive start to the work of the Ukrainian and American teams in Jeddah on March the 11th. So that was that was, I mean, there've been so many of these meetings, it's not always easy to keep track of, but that was the meeting with Rubio and Waltz, at which they came up with the idea of the 30-day complete ceasefire, which Russians, politely rejected. This meeting of the teams significantly helped in moving towards ending the war. So see, it says Zelenskyy is now adopting the language of Trump, helped in moving towards the ending the war. Remember, up until now, there's been no talk about ending the war. It was always about getting Putin to withdraw. So suddenly said help into moving towards the ending the war. We agreed that Ukraine and the United States should continue working together to achieve a real end to the war and lasting peace. We believe that together with America, with President Trump, and under American leadership, lasting peace can be achieved this year. Lasting peace can be achieved this year. So this is moving dramatically forward, and a very different line he's taking from the one that he took during the that disastrous Oval Office meeting, where, if you recall, he said, well, you can't have any kind of a deal because you can't negotiate with Putin. And that's when he got into this fight with J.D. Vance, and this is just on the issue. He said, well, you can't negotiate with Putin. So here's, oh no, here we can, a lasting peace can be achieved this year. So Zelenskyy very much now trying to sound as if he's on Trump's wavelength. President Trump shared details of his conversation with Putin and the key issues discussed. One of the first steps toward fully ending the war could be ending the strikes on energy and other civilian infrastructure. So here you can see Zelenskyy is adopting the American position. Remember, we had the Russians said attacks on energy infrastructure. The American readout was energy and infrastructure, and here he's clearly going very much with the American readout, energy and other civilian infrastructure. I supported this step, and Ukraine confirmed that we are ready to implement it. Okay, so again, you remember Putin on Tuesday said that he is ready to implement that the way he saw it, the ceasefire on attacks on energy infrastructure, and he said, I've given the order to begin implementing it. And now here's Zelenskyy saying, Ukraine confirmed that we are ready to implement it. Our teams discussed this step in Jeddah. The American side also proposed an unconditional ceasefire on the front line. So okay, that was again, this is going back a week. This is the March the 11th meeting. And Ukraine accepted this proposal as well. We will continue working to make this happen. We believe that such steps are necessary to create the possibility for a comprehensive peace agreement to be prepared during the ceasefire. So notice what he's saying here. So he's accepting what now Trump has accepted. Trump obviously he wanted the 30-day ceasefire. The Russians said no, but they said, well, let's talk about a piecemeal ceasefires, which is the ceasefires on the energy infrastructure, then the ceasefire in the Black Sea, and then maybe we can talk about the long-term ceasefire. But here it says, and presumably that's the way Trump wants it. We believe that such steps are necessary to create the possibility for a comprehensive peace agreement to be prepared during the ceasefire. That's clearly, again, that's the Trumpian position. Comprehensive, that we go from the piecemeal ceasefires to the long-term ceasefire. I also provided an update on the battlefield situation and the consequences of Russian strikes. We spoke about the situation in the Kursk region, touched on the issue of the release of POWs and the return of Ukrainian children who were taken by Russian forces. We also discussed the state of Ukraine's air defense and the possibility of strengthening it to protect lives. So here he is putting forward all his usual stuff, talking about the Ukrainian children who were taken by Russian forces. Then talks about the Kursk. He denied, the position that Trump and Putin seem to suggest, that the Ukrainian forces in Kursk are surrounded and are on the brink of annihilation. So he said we spoke about the situation, and then we spoke about the Ukraine, and then he brings up the air defense. This is again, he's constantly asking for more American Patriot missiles for the air defenses. And then we instructed our teams to resolve technical issues related to implementing and expanding the partial ceasefire. Ukrainian and American teams are ready to meet in Saudi Arabia in the coming days to continue coordinating steps toward peace. We instructed our advisors and representatives to carry out this work as quickly as possible. We noted the positive work of our advisors and representatives, Rubio, Waltz, Kellogg, Yermak, Sibiha, Umerov, and Palisa. So they got the American position, Rubio, Waltz, Kellogg, and then you've got the various Ukrainians. And then in further meetings, the teams can agree on all necessary aspects of advancing towards lasting peace and security guarantees. So he brings up the lasting peace, which is what Trump likes to talk about, the security guarantees, which is definitely not what Trump likes to talk about. It's what Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron talk about. He slips that in about the security guarantees, but the Americans do not talk about that. Anyway, and then he goes on. I thank President Trump and the American people for their support. I stress that Ukrainians want peace, which is why Ukraine accepted the proposal for an unconditional ceasefire. I highlighted the importance of President Trump's concept of peace through strength. We agreed to maintain constant contact, including at the highest level and through our teams. So that's where you can see what he's doing here. He's sounding, making all the appropriate noises that Trump wants to hear. The tone is very different from his previous tone. He's talking about lasting peace with the Russians, where before he had said, no, this is absolutely impossible. You can't have any dealings with the Russians. Remember, they even passed a legislation prohibiting any negotiations with Russia. He got into the spat at the Oval Office with J.D. Vance on the issue of negotiating with Russia. Suddenly he's now talking, they're talking about lasting peace. So then we have the statement from Rubio and Waltz, joint statement that they issued. And here we have, and what they say today, President Donald Trump and Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelenskyy had a fantastic phone conversation. See, everyone suddenly starts talking like Trump. It's a fantastic phone conversation. It doesn't sound at all like Rubio and Waltz, but if you're working for Trump, everything is fantastic or incredible. And says, President Zelenskyy thanked President Trump for a productive start for the work of the Ukrainian and American teams in Jeddah on March the 11th. The meeting of senior officials from both nations significantly helped in moving toward ending the war. President Zelenskyy thanked President Trump for the support of the United States, especially the Javelin missiles. Now, this is very interesting that Waltz and Rubio put in their statement about the Javelin missiles, but Zelenskyy himself hadn't said that. There's nothing in that tweet about thanking Trump for the Javelin missiles. So I don't know whether the subject came up and Zelenskyy forgot to mention it, or the subject didn't come up, but Waltz and Rubio thought it's best um, you know, for their protege Zelenskyy to bring, to make it seem as if he had brought up the issue of the Javelin missiles, for which he is duly grateful. The Javelin missile that President Trump was first to provide, and his efforts towards peace. The leaders agreed Ukraine and America will continue working together to bring about a real end to the war. So, okay, and it's a real end, and that lasting peace under President Trump's leadership can be achieved. So again, this, the lasting peace. And then President Trump fully briefed President Zelenskyy on his conversation with Russian President Vladimir Putin and the key issues discussed. They reviewed the situation in Kursk. So again, the situation in Kursk is very interesting because well, we can come to that, but it's interesting that it keeps coming up. And one of the reasons why Kursk is coming up is that it's in the way of some kind of a settlement. I mean, what Trump is obviously looking for is basically, a ceasefire along the line of contact. Just basically, bring it to an end according to where the forces are. The Ukrainian presence in Kursk is a real annoyance because obviously the Russians aren't going to accept any kind of a ceasefire as long as the Ukrainians are occupying Russian territory. So that's why this subject keeps coming up, and they're trying to figure out some way in which the Ukrainian forces can be removed from Kursk. And that's why. So, one of the reasons why Trump wanted to bring up the subject of these forces in Kursk, even though Trump didn't actually mention the forces in Kursk, are on the brink of annihilation, is that it's one way of resolving the problem. Of course, getting them out of Kursk. And Putin went along with this and said, yeah, well, there's one way of resolving the problem, and that is by the forces in Kursk simply surrendering. So, giving up their weapons, surrendering, and they will be taken as prisoners of war. If they don't surrender, then, of course, they will be destroyed. That's why Trump keeps bringing this up, why he's so preoccupied with this, that it's he can see that this is it's actually in the way of some kind of. I mean, there are other things that are obviously in the way of a ceasefire, but that's a very important consideration why it's in the way, because they're in Kursk. The Russians aren't going to accept Ukrainians occupying a piece of Russian territory. So that's why the subject keeps coming up. And then here we go back. So President Trump fully briefed on the they reviewed the situation in Kursk and agreed to share information closely between their defense staffs as the battlefield situation evolved. President Zelenskyy asked for additional air defense systems to protect his civilians. Okay, that comes up in Zelenskyy's tweet, particularly the Patriot missile systems. He's always talking about this Patriot missile system. President Trump agreed to work with him to find what was available, particularly in Europe. Now, this is, of course, very problematic because we've already heard from the Russians, and they've said this over again, that there's no way, no how the Russians will accept any kind of a ceasefire as long as American arms, or not just American arms, but as long as European arms are flowing into Ukraine, and that would, of course, include the Patriot missile system. If you keep sending those Patriot missile systems into Ukraine, then there's no prospect of any kind of a ceasefire. But it says, work with him to find what was available, particularly in Europe. So, I mean, the wording is quite desultory. It's not exactly, yeah, absolutely, we're going to, I'll get on it first thing tomorrow. Well, I'll see what's available, see what I can do. I mean, it's definitely not a particularly a strong commitment on Trump's part to send these Patriot missiles to him. And again, that to me is a clue as to whether maybe we are close to the beginning of the end. Maybe that he doesn't seem particularly committed to sending these Patriot missiles to Zelenskyy. Then he says the two leaders also agreed on a partial ceasefire against energy. Technical teams will meet in Saudi Arabia in the coming days to discuss broadening the ceasefire to the Black Sea on the way to a full ceasefire. So again, this the repetition. The way the American side is trying to operate, which is you moving from one partial ceasefire, then another partial ceasefire, and that's on the way to the full ceasefire. They agreed this could be the first step towards the full end of the war and ensuring security. So they say, look at this is what the full end of the war. This is a complete change from the position just a few months ago in the Biden years, and of course in the EU years. The EU is still taking the position, which is, oh well, nothing's going to happen until we've forced Putin to the negotiating table. Then Putin has to give up territory and whatever. Here they said, no, the way we're going to do it is through a kind of step-by-step process of partial ceasefires and then on to a lasting ceasefire. President Zelenskyy was grateful for the president's leadership in this effort and reiterated his willingness to adopt a full ceasefire. President Trump also discussed Ukraine's electrical supply and nuclear power plants. And then now this is very interesting. Again, this is something new. Remember, when we talked about the previous agreements between the United States and Ukraine, Trump had talked about, well, he first of all started talking about these rare earths, the rare earth metals. Then he talked about a more comprehensive extraction agreement, whether it's oil, coal, gas, and though that agreement hasn't yet been signed, now he suddenly brought up something new, which is Ukraine's electrical supply and nuclear power plants. He said that the United States could be very helpful in running these plants with its electricity and utility expertise. American ownership of these plants would be the best protection for that infrastructure and support for the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. American ownership of these plants. Now, let's keep in mind, the way Trump is thinking about this is that he's not going to make this security commitment. He said, I'm not going to do this security guarantees, the stuff that Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron is talking about. No security guarantees. But he says that the more America gets entangled within Ukraine's economy, the more effectively, de facto, the United States provides a guarantee in that nobody is going to attack Ukraine if Ukraine and the United States are joined at the hip. So, something like that. That's what Trump is doing here. So having first talked about those rare earths, then expanded that to a kind of an energy, to a kind of a nationwide extraction agreement. He's now suddenly brought up something new, which is the electricity grid and the nuclear power plants that America will own, and that will provide Ukraine with security. Because, of course, if the Americans are responsible for the nuclear power plants and the electricity supply, then no one's going to mess with that, because then you're destroying American property, and then the Americans wouldn't appreciate it. So that's the way Trump is thinking here. Now, the interesting thing is that the issue of the nuclear power plants had come up a few days earlier when it was spoken about by Steve Witkoff. He raised the issue of the nuclear power. Oh yeah, we got to talk. That's one of the issues we have to discuss. It came out of nowhere. He suddenly started, oh, it's one of the issues that we have to discuss. But when Witkoff brought up the nuclear power plants, he didn't say, oh, well, basically Americans are going to take them over. He was suggesting the issue of the nuclear power plant in Zaporozhye. So the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, one of the biggest in Europe, is in Zaporozhye, which is about 70% occupied by the Russians, and Russia has claimed Zaporozhye as an integral part of the Russian Federation. But the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is currently under Russian control. So for Witkoff to bring that up, it sounded as if that was an issue that they might negotiate with Russia on. This is about the ownership of that Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. In other words, the nuclear power plant could be transferred, maybe transferred back to Ukraine or transferred to the United States in exchange for additional territory. So in other words, if you want to control, more territory, then basically give up control of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. That may be that's what. But it was very interesting that Witkoff brought up the issue of the nuclear power plant, and then now Trump is suddenly bringing up this issue. And then it says American ownership of those plants would be the best protection for that infrastructure and support for Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Again, so this is the Trump security guarantee. No, I'm not going to not going to put American boots on the ground. I'm not going to put in American missiles, but my security guarantee is that we own your nuclear power plant. So then, what am I doing? Where let me see. Let me go back. And so yeah, then that's right. So now we go on. President Zelenskyy also thanked. So we're still reading from the Waltz Rubio statement. President Zelenskyy also thanked President Trump for continuing to push humanitarian concerns, including the exchange of POWs. And he noted that they had just had a successful exchange and thanked the president for his leadership. President Trump also asked President Zelenskyy about the children who had gone missing from Ukraine during the war. So this is rather interesting because up until now, Trump seemed not to be very interested in the subject. And in fact, the New York Times reported the other day that the United States will cease to gather evidence for any kind of international legal proceedings, particularly by the International Criminal Court, on the issue of the children. They said that the Americans are just not going to go on gathering evidence. This is something that was promised by Biden, by Merrick Garland. Oh yeah, we're going to be really cooperating with this investigation into the so-called abduction of children. Trump obviously hates the International Criminal Court. Basically ruled out any cooperation with this investigation, and that was reported saying, no, we're not going to do this. So that's very interesting that Trump suddenly brings up the issue of the children, about the children who had gone missing from Ukraine during the war, including the ones that had been abducted. So it's very interesting, the formulation here, including the ones that had been abducted. They're not even saying allegedly abducted. So this is definitely a sop for Zelenskyy and a sop for the Europeans by suddenly bringing up this issue of the children and declaring flat out that they had been abducted. Remember, the Russians are obviously absolutely denying categorically that they had abducted the children. The Russians have insisted that that these were Ukrainian children, these were orphans who were moved into Russia to get them out of harm's way, to make sure that they weren't hurt. So there's no question of abduction. And the Russians have said, if any that if they want to return, if anyone wants to return to Ukraine, they will be allowed to return to Ukraine. But here they've used this term abducted, which is quite a strong term. And again, that assumes that the charges brought by the International Criminal Court are true, which is very strange because, of course, the United States takes a very dim view of the International Criminal Court, particularly in its campaign against Israel and its indictment of Bibi Netanyahu. So here suddenly you're getting Waltz and Rubio sounding, as if they're signing off on what the International Criminal Court is claiming. It says President Trump promised to work closely with both parties to help make sure those children were returned home. Okay, so returned home. So he just deals with the humanitarian aspect of it. But it's very hard to know because, as we know, Trump doesn't think things through particularly carefully. He does tend to react somewhat emotionally, and particularly on issues of children and babies. Remember how he reacted entirely emotionally on the babies who allegedly had been attacked with chemical weapons by Bashar al-Assad, and that helped decide Trump to launch missile attacks on Syria. The poor babies, the children, the beautiful babies' faces and whatever. So somehow it sounds very much like somebody had got to Trump, because he's never brought this subject up before. Somebody had got to Trump and said to him, well, what about these children, these little children, these poor little children who had been abducted from Ukraine? What are we going to do about that? What are you going to do about these poor little children? And Trump, who I think hadn't really been aware of this, or to the extent that he basically said, we're not cooperating. I mean, that was the story that was published in the New York Times just a few days ago, that the Trump administration will not be cooperating with the ICC in this investigation into the children. And then suddenly here he is. He's saying, "Oh, I really feel terrible. What are we going to do about these these children? And then we have to make sure that they go home." So here we have. And then they all agreed. They agreed all parties must continue the effort to make a ceasefire work. The president noted the positive work of their advisors and representatives, especially Secretary Rubio, National Security Advisor Waltz, Special Envoy Kellogg, and others. The president instructed their teams to move ahead with the technical issues related to implementing and broadening the partial ceasefire. So that's the technical issues. Remember that broadening the partial ceasefire. Now, they're going ahead with that. There's going to be meetings early next week in Saudi Arabia on this to discuss this issue of implementing this partial ceasefire, which is the attacks on energy infrastructure. I mean, they can keep saying energy and infrastructure, but the Russians are saying it's just simply energy infrastructure. So, technically related to implementing and broadening the partial ceasefire, the presidents instructed their advisors and representatives to carry out this work as quickly as possible. The president emphasized that in further meetings, the teams can agree on all necessary aspects of towards lasting peace and security. In further meetings, in other words, this goes back to the Trump idea that this is a step-by-step process as we move towards this lasting peace and security, which is obviously not what Zelenskyy wants, certainly not what the Europeans want, but that's what Trump wants, and so that's what they have to emphasize. Yeah, these teams, we start off with negotiations about implementing this partial ceasefire, and then we'll move on towards the lasting peace and security. Now, remember during the conversation between Trump and Putin, they said that they were going to create these teams. Each side was going to create the teams to discuss getting to a lasting agreement. Here, they seem to be talking just, how to implement the partial ceasefire. Anyway, here we have the story in from the Telegraph, the London Telegraph, and it says here, President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy discussed American ownership of nuclear power plants in Ukraine in a phone call on Wednesday, the White House said. Zelenskyy offered a different account on Thursday. So on Thursday, Zelenskyy just spends all his time traveling around, meeting all sorts of leaders. So he met today. He met the Finnish president. He met some Norwegian government officials. So Zelenskyy offered a somewhat different account. He said that only one nuclear power plant had been discussed, the sprawling Zaporozhye plant, which is occupied by Russian forces, and that U.S. ownership was not on the table. So again, as I said, the Zaporozhye plant was exactly what Steve Witkoff had brought up. That's the one that and the reason I think it's significant, because they're talking about some kind of deal, exchanging land and for something else. So that's why they're talking about Zaporozhye. Hey, we could change ownership. Russians own it. Russians control it now. Russians could transfer Zaporozhye in exchange for Ukraine giving up land for the Russians. So that's it. Zelenskyy said, no, they only talked about this Zaporozhye, which is what Witkoff talked about, but the readout, we went through the readout. The readout said, no, all of nuclear power plants in Ukraine. And then Zelenskyy, this is during his news conference with the Finnish president. So Zelenskyy says, well, President Trump asked me, what do you think about this plant? This is Zaporozhye. What do you think about this plant? I told him that if it does not remain Ukrainian, it won't function for anyone. It does not remain Ukrainian, it won't function for anyone. So this is not he was in Oslo. It wasn't in Helsinki. Zelenskyy said at a news conference in Oslo. It's illegal. It simply won't work. And then, despite rejecting the idea of U.S. ownership of the Zaporozhye plant, Zelenskyy said he was open to working with the United States on the issue. So you see, he says he's open to working with the United States on the issue. And then he says, the U.S. wants to take it back from the Russians and invest in its modernization. This is a separate issue, one that remains open for discussion. We can talk about that. So that's what I mean. You can see the outlines of some kind of a deal that's in the works here. So Zaporozhye, the Russians give up Zaporozhye to the United States. The United States promises to invest capital in Zaporozhye, modernize it, and manage it. It basically is going to manage it, quite efficiently. In the meantime, for having given that up, and Russia doesn't really need the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. I mean, Russia has plenty of nuclear power plants of its own, so it doesn't really need it. But in exchange for handing the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant to the Americans, Russia will want territorial concessions. And the issue with the territorial concessions is that, that other than Lugansk, the 3 of the 4 oblasts are not fully under Russian control. Russia still hasn't brought Donetsk Oblast, hasn't brought Zaporozhye and Kherson under full control. So if it hands over Zaporozhye, then that could be the basis for some kind of a deal. And then here's another story. The next Russia-U.S. talks on Ukraine will take place on March the 24th in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, the Kremlin said. That which is next Monday. Okay, yeah. We agreed with Mr. Waltz, the U.S. National Security Advisor, that consultations on this matter in a bilateral format will be conducted by experts appointed by the president. So you can see so there are 2 sets of talks scheduled to start in Saudi Arabia next Monday. There's the U.S.-Ukraine talks, and that, as I've said, that's about implementing the partial ceasefire. And at the same time, there are also the U.S.-Russian talks, which I think are going to be much more extensive. They won't just be about the implementing of the partial ceasefire. Anyway, this is Ushakov who said this. Consultations on the matter will be conducted by experts and the president. These consultations will take place. Yeah, okay. Mr. Ushakov, I can't even spell. They can't even spell the damn name. Mr. Ushakov said the Russian delegation will be headed by Grigory Karasin, a senator and career diplomat, and Sergei Beseda, an advisor to the director of the Russian FSB security agency. So that's kind of interesting. So Beseda is an FSB man, which is the Russia's security agency. The talks will mainly concern ways to ensure safe shipping in the Black Sea. All right, so that's the first stage as Trump envisages. So we're going to talk about the safe shipping in the Black Sea, and that supposedly will lead to further negotiations. And then the usual stuff. Starmer warns Putin of severe consequences if he breaches peace deal. UK leader says Russia cannot veto how Ukraine defends itself as Western military officials meet to draft security plans. Vladimir Putin will face severe consequences if he breaches a peace deal with Ukraine. Keir Starmer has warned as Western military planners begin drawing up plans to enforce any agreement between the 2 countries. It's so bizarre. It really is kind of bizarro world where there's no deal. I mean, we're talking about this entirely a kind of a very tentative step-by-step process of going from one partial ceasefire to another partial ceasefire, and then maybe there'll be some talk about an exchange of territory, giving up Kursk, and giving up the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and that might lead to a long-lasting ceasefire. Here, these people aren't talking about any of that. They're just saying, "Oh, we're ready with the Western military planners to enforce an agreement." What agreement? There's no agreement to enforce. We're drawing up plans to enforce any agreement. What agreement? The British Prime Minister issued his warning, and he's already warning. We don't have anything yet, and he's already issuing his warnings to the Russian president after meeting officials from 31 countries at the Northwood military base outside London, where they have started stretching out which Western forces might be deployed to protect Ukraine in the future. And then he told, this is Starmer talking, the point of security arrangements is to make it clear to Russia there will be severe consequences if they are to breach any deal. This is why it will require a US component, because it needs to be clear to Putin that there will be severe consequences if he breaches the lines. So the purpose of this plan is to ensure that we maintain the peace as it is in Estonia and all other countries in which we're deployed. Now, the reason why it's worth looking at these statements of Starmer and Macron um, is that they are in a position to sabotage any agreement. I mean, if they continue, basically, look, as we saw from Trump's kind of tentative statement about the Patriot missiles, he gave no real commitment. He said, "Well, I'm going to take a look, see what's available," but he gave no commitment on on sending the Patriot missiles. But ultimately, the Americans are not really able to stop the Europeans from sending in their weapons into Ukraine, and they're not, and Americans aren't really able to stop their sending their personnel into Ukraine, and that is that's a that's, as far as the Russians go, that's a deal breaker. There's no way that they've made clear, and there's no way in the world that they're going to accept a NATO presence in Ukraine, and that's what Britain and France are. So the Britain and France are clearly, with all these meetings, and there are these meetings are now taking place on a daily basis. And so here you've got the Americans who are just talking about this, how we can move forward on the step-by-step basis towards some kind of a lasting ceasefire. These people are having these regular meetings. Essentially, how can we sabotage this agreement? They're absolutely determined to prevent this deal from taking place. And so they that's so I have to say, because I just saw, Mark says 2020 says anybody who thinks Russia is giving up the Zaporozhye nuclear plant is delusional. Russia will keep talking. The American negotiations are lightweights. The Russians are running rings around them. Well, nice try. I just look, the reason why there are these negotiations is that I think for everybody, the Russians and the Americans realized that it's a law of diminishing returns. To keep this war going is futile. It's not in anyone's interest. For a while, for several years, the Americans thought it was in their interest to keep degrading, weakening, and destroying Russia. Then that was then, but that's it. It's no longer in America's interest to do so. The Americans have changed their mind. There are many reasons why. We can certainly talk about why the Americans have changed their position, why they don't think it's any longer in America's interest to weaken, degrade, humiliate, and destroy Russia. But for Russia also, it's essentially they need this peace. They need the peace. They can't just go on. The scale of the casualties are staggering. They need to bring this thing to an end. So if there's a basis, and then for a peace, for whatever it is, exchange of territories, handing over the nuclear power plant for Ukraine, it doesn't matter. Ukraine is going to. There will be a state of Ukraine at the end of this. Russia has clearly not set its goal, whatever the goal it may originally have been in February 2022. It's no longer that goal. The goal of taking over Ukraine, removing the government in Kiev, that's not the Russia's goal anymore. So there will be a Ukraine. This Ukraine will need nuclear power plants. It's going to need. It's going to have an economy. It's going to have to. We'll have to rebuild. It's going to have to rebuild. It's as a functioning society. That's going to take years and years. So it needs its energy. It needs its oil. It needs everything. Now I don't know whether that it is going to be part of the deal, but the Zaporozhye power plant. I think it's very interesting that they're talking about it. And that it could well be the basis of some kind of an exchange. But I don't know. But it's very interesting that they're talking about this. It hasn't come up before. Now they're talking about it. It was mentioned by Witkoff. It was mentioned by Trump. Mentioned by Waltz and Rubio. It's mentioned by Zelensky. Clearly, it's being discussed. Whether it's going to be, they're actually going to work something out is a different issue. But clearly, could well be the basis for some kind of an exchange. Russia's not really giving up anything on that because Russia has its own nuclear power plant. It's got plenty of them. Russia's a big exporter of nuclear power plants. I mean, it's one of the biggest. Builds nuclear power plants all over the world. So it doesn't need any more nuclear power plants. So we'll have to see. Now, so the reason that I brought all this up right at the beginning, which was that are we on the brink of some kind of a of the end of the war? I don't know. Clearly, there are moves towards serious moves towards ending it. I think Ukraine obviously didn't want to end it. I mean, we saw what happened at the meeting in the Oval Office. Zelensky wants this to continue. The Europeans, they still, from all these statements from Starmer and Macron and the rest, they want this to continue. Who doesn't want this to continue? The United States doesn't want it to continue. That's a big player. And I think Russia wants an end to this. You always have to think about your national interest, and you have to take a long-term view of national interest. Here's an opportunity that has emerged with Trump for a historic improvement of relations between the United States and Russia. It's historic. Trump is talking in ways that no leader has talked about improving relations since since the heyday of détente. That it might not lead to anything, but if you're the Russians and you have to think in terms of what are your long-term interests, then a partnership, some form of a partnership with the United States, is that's quite a big deal, because yes, Trump won't be there forever. Trump, he'll be gone by 2028, but who knows who'll come after him, and he may be somebody who will continue with that same process. If you look at the history of American Soviet relations, the lowest moment in the Cold War was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that was a low point. I mean, they almost came to war at that time. However, once they came through the Cuban Missile Crisis, that inaugurated an era of 16, 17 years of détente. Those are 16, 17 years of détente. So it happens. You go, you reach the depths, and then you can improve it. So I'm not saying this is going to happen, but it is possible that we are beginning to see that the shape of some kind of a deal that's in the works. Now, one thing that won't happen will be there won't be a peace treaty. No one's going to sign any peace treaty. All that the most that'll be agreed on will be an armistice. They're going to some kind of, when will the guns stop firing? They'll create a demilitarized zone. The armed forces will have to retreat from the demilitarized zone, and then all final status issues will be negotiated down the road, on the long-term basis. So there'll be no kind of final settlement between Russia and Ukraine. I don't see. I don't see. I mean, I think Zelenskyy is going to be there for a while, and even if it's not Zelenskyy, it'll be somebody else who will pursue very similar goals. So therefore, there's not going to be any kind of an agreement on 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 our future Russia-Ukraine relations. All that there'll be an agreement on is to stop firing at one another, and then the idea is, well, we'll discuss this down the road. Well, it worked in Korea. Okay, that came along. That basically was an armistice, and you've had peace. 70 years of peace. There was no peace treaty. No peace treaty was signed. Germany, there was no movement towards any kind of a political accommodation. So again, essentially, it was a ceasefire. They worked out a kind of a modus vivendi with their forces. They finally, in 1971, they signed a four-power agreement on Berlin. But the underlying issues in Germany, which was, hey, are we actually going to move towards the reunification of the two halves of Germany? That was kicked down the road. No one did anything about that. Vietnam, there was a partition in Vietnam, but that didn't last. That war just continued until finally Vietnam was united under the communists. So you never know. I mean, different situations have can be the basis for a more long-lasting peace. Just a few decades. Turkey invaded Cyprus, seized a territory in Cyprus. No one in the world recognizes, with the exception of Turkey, the northern Cyprus, which is under Turkish control. No one recognizes it. However, it's kept the two sides away from each other. There's no war between them. So even if say no one in the world is going to recognize the induction of the oblasts into the Russian Federation, no one's going to recognize it. But no one's going to try and mess around with it either. So let's all these are possibilities. Now, the other thing is, which I think makes me wonder about whether this is the beginning of the end, is the fact that the war in the Middle East is, or the war in the Middle East, I should probably use a somewhat different expression. Israel's war on Gaza seems to be escalating. The America's attacks on the Houthis also escalating. America's targeting of Iran also escalating. So what that would suggest to me, that as one war winds down, another war is going into into high gear. So that would suggest again that if the Americans are now beginning to focus quite intensely on the Middle East, it sounds like they want to basically wrap this up. They have no interest at all in continuing with Ukraine, and it's a very interesting. So first of all, the breakdown of the ceasefire, Israel's abandonment of the ceasefire, was completely unnecessary, but probably would not have taken place but for the intervention of Trump. I mean, it was Trump who kind of egged on the Israelis repeatedly, and extremely in an extremely inflammatory way, talking about his long-term solution in Gaza, by ridding all the Palestinians in Gaza, by talking about well, I don't want to continue with the ceasefire as long as Hamas is holding hostages. So he's been encouraging Netanyahu to end the ceasefire. So Trump has been doing this, and it's a very odd thing because Trump had come to power in 2015, not just being the anti-war candidate, the anti-interventionist candidate, but explicitly the anti-wars in the Middle East candidate. He attacked Bush, George W. Bush, his brother Jeb, precisely on the ground that they had pushed America into this war in the Middle East. America, he just gave this estimate, $7-8 trillion that they lost in these wars. There's absolutely no reason for America to do it. And yet it seems like that he's determined to get America into a war in the Middle East. Not at all clear why he's doing this, but this is clearly going to be his war. It's very unlikely that Netanyahu would have essentially ended this ceasefire had he not been encouraged to do so by the United States. And all the noise that's coming from Netanyahu is, oh, well, the White House is right behind us. And the White House is entirely behind Netanyahu. And it's the same White House that is threatening universities by withholding funds from universities, on the grounds that they're tolerating anti-Semitism and whatever. This looks like the project that Trump wants to focus his attention on. As I say, it's very, very, very odd why he would want to do it. This is, Israel is nothing to him. And indeed, he himself has acknowledged that the wars in the Middle East really have nothing to do with America's interest. They're about Israel's interest, and so basically saying, well, we're fighting wars for the purpose of Israel, to make Israel. We're pursuing an Israel first strategy. So it's a very strange issue, but the very fact that they're focusing on that would suggest to me that they need to just wrap this. That they're trying to get one war out of the way in order to fight another war, and the war in Gaza is I think is really getting quite nasty. The question then is, one has to raise is, first of all, does Netanyahu enjoy sufficient support in Israel to essentially restart the war? I mean, remember, this war is now October, so it's 18 months now. So it'll be 18 months. Is there really appetite within Israel for restarting the whole thing? And particularly in that Netanyahu has really not provided any I don't know, a cogent account for how he's actually going to succeed in achieving his objectives. I mean, he's had 18 months and he still hasn't achieved his objectives. I mean, we're going to destroy Hamas. Well, you haven't destroyed Hamas. Yeah, you've killed all these leaders. Okay, you can kill all these leaders, but that hasn't done the job. And so therefore, you have to wonder whether these raids. I mean, there's obviously something like 22 living hostages that effectively Netanyahu is now abandoning by relaunching this war. But all the rest of it, he still has no explanation. Well, who's going to run Gaza? He said it's not going to be Hamas. You're going to destroy Hamas. Okay, fine. But what's going to happen in Gaza? Who's going to run it? Now, it may be that there's a plot among, all those people, Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and all the rest of them, to drive the Palestinians out of Gaza. Well, that also hasn't happened. And they've had 18 months to do it. They haven't driven them out. And they can't drive them out because they can't go to Egypt. Egypt is not going to accept them. To try to force them on Egypt means essentially going to war with Egypt. I don't think the United States wants to create a disaster in the Middle East of going to war with Egypt, because going to war with Egypt would also probably mean going to war against Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia and Egypt are very close, and anything that would weaken the government of Sisi would infuriate Saudi Arabia. So you'd have to go war against Egypt. You'd have to go war against Saudi Arabia. Not a good time to do it if you're also going to war against Iran. So it's not going to happen. This is just fantasy that they're going to drive the Gazans into the Sinai. So you're still just, basically Netanyahu offers nothing more than, well, let's just continue this war. Let's just keep this war going. And Trump is going along with it, and that's sort of very strange. I mean, he's got a very full plate at home. He's got enough problems at home with fighting against all the judges, fighting against, even now, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. There's going to be intense resistance from within the government to Trump's program, and yet he's wants to go down this path of fighting Israel's war when there's obviously nothing whatever in it for the United States. What the hell does the United States care? Who the hell runs Gaza? I mean, this is nonsense of Riviera on the Mediterranean or whatever. It's ridiculous. Riviera of the Middle East. It's a ridiculous idea. But he's doing one sensible thing. I mean, he's pursued an intelligent, sensible policy by and large on Ukraine, seeing that this war makes no sense. There's no way that this in any way helps the United States, and then he completely undermines that sensible policy with a truly loony policy of getting the United States to support the most loony idea imaginable, which is to drive 2 million or whatever Palestinians out of Gaza and into Egypt and Jordan, which would just cause absolute bedlam in the Middle East. War with Egypt, war with Saudi Arabia. It's a totally nutty idea, but that seems to be where Trump is heading. So, but I think it's somehow he's one war is being wrapped up, and then another one is being but essentially pushed on a kind of on the front burner. Anyway, let's see what's going on with the Gaggle locals page, where the people who really worry very much about the dogs and know that these dogs who really have this tendency to blame everything on me and just going straight for my throat because I'm not really delivering for them. So I really appreciate all the the kindness shown by gagglers who worry about my health because of these dogs. So thank you, everyone. Robert, so always good to see you, Robert, from New Jersey. And then Ivan Grozny says, "Good evening, George. How's life?" Well, it's always bleak. I mean, that's it. I mean, it's whatever it is. It's it's, you know whatever the news, it's always bad news. But anyway, Ivan Grozny says, "Watch Laura Ingram's interview with Trump." Yeah, we showed some of that in the podcast with Peter on Wednesday. She is completely unbearable. Yeah, I go along with that. I really don't understand why people in the Trump administration even bother continuing to talk with them when they have the manners to interrupt, disagree, or correct them. Last time I checked, no one cares what Laura Ingraham thinks. Well, I think that's true. But what Trump has done is he gets interviews with friendly journalists, and she's by and large a friendly journalist. Uh, and this is Fox News. He does an awful lot of stuff for Fox News. He regards them as by and large friendly. Fox News isn't particularly friendly, but it has clearly Ingram, Hannity, Jesse Waters. I mean, they usually are friendly to him. Now, the other thing that you just mentioned there is the interruption and the argument. That is extremely annoying. I mean, there's no question. It's annoying, and it doesn't really get anywhere with him because I think he if you try to interrupt him and bring up these various issues, he's going to parry it. He's very good at parrying it, and then goes off on a tangent. So she's always done that. She's always interrupting, not just Trump, but in all her interviews. I haven't watched the show now for a long time. I only used to watch it when I used to watch Fox News for Tucker Carlson, but ever since Fox News fired him, I don't really watch Fox News, so I don't really watch her show anymore. But she was always interrupting her guests, talking more than her guests, which I think is always a very bad manners. I mean, you've invited a guest on, let the guest speak, rather than you insisting on showing the world how frightfully clever you are and that you can out argue whatever clever person you brought on. So it's always annoying. Um, and the other thing I always found annoying about her is the first name thing. It's always this doing the first name thing. So she brings on Alan Dershowitz, and it's this Alan this and Alan that, and it's just. I mean, she's so desperate to show how what good friends she is with Alan Dershowitz, a Harvard professor. That it's just this constant, like Victor Davis Hanson. It's just this Victor. You just can't take it after a while. So yeah, I'm now you bring this memory back to me. I haven't watched her in such a long time, so I've forgotten how annoying she is. Anyway, thank you. Ivan Grozny then goes on. Trump's comments on Canada are interesting, but why is Trump holding back on larger tariffs, etc., on him if his goal is making it the 51st state? Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that he hasn't really pursued the tariffs policy in any consistent way. I don't know whether he. I mean, I mean, tariffs are supposed to be a policy to make sure that your products, your domestically made products, are competitive relative to imports. So you tax imports. Now I think that's a very sound economic policy, and many countries have practiced it. And incidentally, when you look at the tables of which countries have the biggest tariffs, the United States is actually very low down in the order. Most countries have far more tariffs than the United States does. And so Trump has a reasonable point. He says that, we're getting shafted. We have virtually no tariffs. Other countries have enormous tariffs. India has huge tariffs. The EU has huge tariffs. The UK has huge tariffs. And thanks to these tariffs, the United States keeps running a trade deficit. Now, this all made sense during the Cold War when the United States was anxious to build up the economies of its client states. So it was happy to run trade deficits with its clients because well, they need to rebuild. They got to become strong economies, and it doesn't really matter. We're on a deficit because all the money is going to come back to us anyway. It's going to come to Wall Street, and we're all going to make a lot of money. The price that you pay for that was, of course, deindustrialization, and Trump's come into power to address the deindustrialization problem. But that was, that's perfectly reasonable. All that is perfectly reasonable to do this, and to make American tariffs, comparable to what the tariffs other countries have. The issue of the Canada, I mean, that's really just a separate one. He just seems to have come up with that relatively recently. He never really talked about the Canada as the 51st state during the election campaign. I don't think he ever brought that up. I think it's something it's a nice idea and it's quite amusing, but it's not really doable. So I think that the tariffs, I think, is just and the Canada thing is just these are separate issues. I don't know what's going to act as more of an incentive for Canada to join the United States. Completely free trade, or American, the American coercion. American coercion is unlikely to make the Canadians particularly want to join the United States, but I don't think the Canadians particularly want to be a part of the United States. But even more important, I'm not sure the United States really wants Canada. I mean, they're sort of different people. They're very unlike the Americans. I don't think you put that to a vote, which you'd have to in any case if you're going to make Canada the 51st state. You're going to have to. All the states will have to decide. I have my doubts that very many states are going to want the Canadians. And indeed, the ones who probably would want the Canadians are not really the Trump people. I mean, you might have sort of all kinds of liberals, American liberals, blue states. The blue states might say, yeah, we want Canada. The Canadians are a bit like us. They're kind of liberal. They have very liberal immigration policies. They have all this wokeism there. DEI, all that. They brought in all these Sikhs. Just look at the parliament in Ottawa. Wherever you look, it's just Sikhs sitting there. So the people who actually might be happy to bring Canada into the United States would really not be Trump supporters. They would be, like, the blue states and say, hey, now we're going to get some additional weight on our side. We're going to get some, lots and lots of liberals like us as part of the United States, and they're going to support us. Not that I think those people would vote for Canada to be the 51st state, but the people who really wouldn't be enthusiastic about Canada in the United States would be MAGA. America first. The Trumpians are the ones who would be the least enthusiastic about getting a whole bunch of boring liberals in the United States. Boring liberals who are going to look down on them. These boring liberals are going to look down on the red states and treat them as really uncouth rednecks. So I don't see that bringing Canada in does anything to support America First or MAGA. Just as I said, I don't quite see how doing Israel's bidding does anything for MAGA and America First. But that's another Trumpian policy that's a head scratcher. Anyway, um, um, Ivan Grozny says also the effects of the Ukrainian invasion into the Belgorod region and how it will affect things. Well, I don't think they're not going to be able to hold on to very much territory in Belgorod. They've tried that before, but all of these things, without question, make a settlement harder, and it's because you know the outlines of a settlement are basically uh, a, um, a ceasefire along the line of contact, plus some, exchanges. So territory for the Zaporozhye power plant, maybe Kursk that has to be eliminated. Um, but anything that involves Ukrainians in invading territory, they're not going to be able to hold on to Belgorod. Only complicates things. And as we've seen from what we were reading the slides, um, Zelenskyy is now on Trump's page. He's talking Trump's language because he knows that's his best shot. So he knows that those goals that he had presented, driving the Russians out of Ukraine and all the rest of it, that's not feasible. And in fact, the whole talk also even of Ukraine in NATO, that's also no longer even up for discussion. So I think what is the most serious problem, I think, for a negotiated outcome is what the Europeans are going to do. Because if the Europeans say that we're not going to be bound by anything the Americans and the Russians agree on, or the Americans and the Ukrainians agree on, because Europeans are not part of this negotiation, that means they say we can go on sending arms to Ukraine, and we can therefore go on undermining any possible agreement. Anyway, thank you, Ivan Grozny. Marty puts a picture of Harold Shand. Harold Shand contemplates the Russia-Ukraine ceasefire talks. So Harold Shand, this is from the very last scene of Long Good Friday, where he Harold Shand had naively thought that he had finally dealt with his IRA problem, having killed off a whole bunch of IRA people in a kind of a big kind of Saturday night massacre. And then he gets into a taxi cab, and lo and behold, the taxi cab is driven by a bunch of IRA people, and he suddenly knows that the jig is up. And that's the very last scene where it freezes on Bob Hoskins as Harold Shand's face. So Harold Shand contemplates the Russia-Ukrainian ceasefire. Also, thanks a lot, Marty. And so keep voting. So this was the film, which unfortunately we didn't have a screening, but I mean it's been posted on the locals page about films about London. And then we still got to decide what the runner-up will be, which we will feature in the screening on Monday. So please continue to vote. It's the poll is to be found on our locals page. So to say which film you want to see about London. Last time I looked, I think The Servant, Joseph Losey and Harold Pinter's The Servant was leading in the runner-up polls. But so please vote. Marty, Merry Thursday, George and Gagglers. Thank you so much. As always, thank you for your generosity. And the dogs also, thank you. They thank you. They never thank me, but they thank you, Marty. Thank you. Ivan Grozny says, our forces still encircled in Kursk. I feel like the front lines haven't moved much in the past few days. Yeah, I think so. Of course, they're denying. Ukraine has denied that they are encircled, and I don't see the evidence, incidentally, that they are encircled. I mean, that this was Trump seemed to get that into his head that they're encircled, and Putin seemed to go along with it, but he didn't quite. Putin didn't quite confirm that they are encircled. Putin just said, "Hey, we'll spare their lives, we'll treat them humanely, but they have to surrender first." But the issue of the encirclement it was Trump who really talked about encirclement. Putin suggested that they were completely encircled, that they had no hope of getting out, but he didn't quite say it explicitly. But that's going to have to be part of any kind of a deal. They have to be removed. There's no way that anything can be agreed upon as long as the Ukrainians are holding any Russian territory. Carlos, always good to see you. Ciao from Italy, Ottawa. From Italy, Ottawa. All right, thank you. Robert says, from Robert from New Jersey, there are 3 other nuclear power plants in Ukraine, apparently all Soviet era nuclear technology. How Americans would be able to provide technical support for these than the Russians is a question for the ages. I don't know. The I mean, I guess they can do it. I mean, I guess Americans have the know-how. Americans have the capital. They can invest in upgrading it. But I don't know exactly what the United States would get out of it. I mean, for the Ukrainians, it might be a very good deal because it does indeed get the United States enmeshed in Ukraine and Ukraine's energy and so on, and thereby the Ukraine and the United States become joined at the hip. I mean, I think that does make sense for them. What the Americans would get out of it, I don't quite know. So it seems like an offer. Oh, we'll invest in your nuclear power plants, we'll modernize it, and then Trump saying own it now, or maybe they'll just say we'll run it. But I don't know how much money they can make out of that. So I don't know what they'll get out of it. But for Ukraine, I think that would be quite a good deal. Because that I think they get a lot of they'll get if Americans really come up with the capital and they really will modernize these power plants. It's not bad. It's not a bad deal for them. That's why I think they haven't ruled this out. So there was a lot of indignation of American imperialism. They're going to steal these power plants. It hasn't. This is more. It's much more for Ukraine than it is for the United States. Anne Marie, very good to see you, Anne Marie. Thank you so much for your generosity. Thank you, Anne Marie, above all for your very interesting and observations and insight about the John Adams piece that was the posted as part of the Gaggle Music Club, the John Adams Harmonie Lehre, which is a kind of a play on Schoenberg's 12-tone scale, or the Harmonie Lehre was the name of Schoenberg's treatise where he outlined the 12-tone scale. But this is much more accessible than Schoenberg. And what I think is really interesting in what Anne Marie wrote is that she, as a professional musician, as somebody who has played this kind of music, John Adams and John Cage, that it's just what it's like to play music that at least in its early stages is very repetitious. Then I think it becomes much more appealing, and much more of the kind of has the echoes of European late romantic music. But in its early stages, it is extremely repetitive. So somehow it's often, when it's repetitive, it's hard to listen to, but it's even harder to play. And I think that's what's really interesting. What Anne Marie says, when you play, your fingers start hurting because you just keep having to repeat and repeat and repeat, and it's a very it's extremely demanding. It's physically very, very demanding. So listen to the uh, John Adams Harmonia Lehre and read Anne Marie's very interesting, insightful observation about her as a professional musician, what it was like to play John Adams and John Cage. So thank you so much, Anne Marie. Really appreciate it. Laura, always good to see you, Laura. So she's responding to Robert about the nuclear power plants. She says Zelenskyy already said that nuclear power plants can't be privatized, but they could collaborate with the U.S. managing them. That's exactly what he said. Yeah, managing them, and that's it. They would manage them, and the U.S. would invest in them. I believe this Zaporozhye nuclear power plant already worked with Westinghouse technology. All the spent fuel pools are because of that. Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. That's why I don't think, in principle, it's going to be such a big deal. If that's going to be part of, I mean, we don't know this. It's purely we're speculating here whether that's going to be part of any deal, any exchange, the nuclear power plant for the territory. Russia doesn't need the nuclear power plant. I mean, it's just it's got plenty of nuclear power plants of its own. But if it's going to be a part of the settlement, I mean, what the Russians are really now prizing above all is this relationship with the United States. You know, when you read TASS now, you read the comments of Zaharova, the comments of Lavrov, the Putin. What are they all saying? They're saying we've got this new relationship with the United States. You know, we don't care about the Europeans. You know, we absolutely they're ridiculous. They're pointless. They're warmongers. We're not going to talk to them. We're not interested in them. But we do prize our relationship with the new team in Washington. So that's why, if there's a possibility of this deal, and the deal it involves the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, I think the Russians will go for it. I mean, if they just, you want the power plant, we can transfer that, and in exchange for territory. So that basically we get the oblasts more or less in the complete territory of the oblasts within the Russian Federation. I mean, I think these are the out. This is how I started saying these are the outlines. I think of some kind of a settlement. It's not going to be a final settlement because I don't think there's going to be a peace treaty, and I don't think they're really going to sit down and negotiate a peace treaty. But it's it could be laying the foundation for a permanent ceasefire. So a ceasefire that will at least last a few years. And then Anne Marie says, but it seems that Trump doesn't care too much about the children of Gaza. Not in the slightest. Not in the slightest. Absolutely not. It's like he's suddenly talking about the children in Ukraine. He sounds so humanitarian. He's talking about all the hundreds of thousands of people who have died in Ukraine, but absolutely nothing. He has no pity whatsoever for the Palestinians. Anyway, but Laura, I meant to thank you for your comment about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. But yeah, Anne Marie, yeah, he absolutely doesn't care. Does not care for them at all. Robert, thank you for your generosity. And Robert says, by the way, regarding the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, I just learned that even by 1997, there were still Russian military bases in Ukraine, originally set up by the USSR. Was the situation similar with the Warsaw Pact countries, where the withdrawal of now Russian military happened only very slowly over a period of years? Not to my knowledge. I mean, I think that the withdrawal of Soviet forces from the Warsaw Pact country was done fairly rapidly. I mean, I think that there were obviously real. I mean, Ukraine was a part of the USSR, a key part of the USSR. And therefore the military bases, the military infrastructure of the Soviet armed forces was thoroughly ingrained in Ukraine, and so it was not at all easy uh, to um, to withdraw. And I would imagine it would take some time for withdrawal. I didn't realize that even in 1997 there were still Russian military bases, but I don't know, whether there's anything very much in those military bases by then. The Budapest Memorandum was just simply that this was 1994, so this was already several years after the dissolution of the USSR. But this was just, there were still these outstanding problems. Um, I mean, Russia and Ukraine were obviously very closely um, entangled with one another, so it was not easy to disentangle. And clearly the the issue of the nuclear weapons was a part of that. Even by 1994, 3 years later, 3 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, these missiles were still in Ukraine. There was just still outstanding business that needed to be done, and the Americans, were willing to come up with some money to do this. So you just finally get those missiles out of Ukraine and into Russia. So this was something that was very much the Americans wanted. They wanted those missiles removed, and it's just yeah, and what's important, I've emphasized, is that all of the people who took part in those negotiations with the Budapest Memorandum, and the nuclear weapons were moved out of Ukraine, they were moved out of Belarus. All of them um, were convinced that that there was nothing here. There were no commitments made to Ukraine. No, there were no commitments. No one made any commitments. Oh, to your territorial integrity and we security guarantees or anything like that. No one for one moment thought that any security guarantees were issued to Ukraine. All that was happening here was that some outstanding business needed to be finished off. These missiles belonged to Russia. They belonged to the Soviet Union. Belonged to the Soviet armed forces, and now they were going to be under the control of the Russian armed forces, because the Russian armed forces were the successors to the Soviet armed forces. So, but thank you so much, Robert. Marx 2023 says, Iran must stop all aid to Yemen, or Mr. Peace will strike Iran with Israel. America must keep arming Ukraine for a long-term peace. Well, we'll see whether America will keep on arming Ukraine. As I said, if we look at that statement from Waltz and Rubio, it didn't sound like Trump was promising anything very much, by way of weaponry. I mean, it may still happen, but he said, "Yeah, well, I'll see what there is in our stockpile." So we'll see what he does. But he's taking a very different approach, Ukraine, to the one that he's taking in Iran. I still have to think that Trump wouldn't be crazy enough to get into a war with Iran. I mean, I I, I, I hope he wouldn't be crazy enough. Just like I kind of think that he's not crazy enough to try and push 2 million Palestinians out of Gaza. I hope he isn't crazy enough. He just seems so nutty. But that the threat that he issued against Iran the other day, it's like, hey, any attack on the Houthis, any attack on the part of the Houthis will take to be an attack from Iran, which seemed like almost he's threatening war against Iran. That he's just doing the whole madman theory of politics. So hey, that if I can frighten people, then I can get them to do what I want them to do. it's not a good strategy. It's very rare that you can actually frighten anyone into doing something they don't want to do. Anyway, Ivan Grozny says, um, uh, Mark says, George, this will all be settled on the battlefield. Good try, Georgia. European arms warehouses are empty. America is overstretched. Well, I don't think that's true. Again, I just don't think. America is a bloody big economy, as I've said before. America's a big, bloody big economy. It can absolutely churn out a lot of artillery shells. It can churn out a lot of weaponry. It's the biggest arms exporter by far in the world, so it produces an awful lot of weaponry. If it wanted, it could absolutely, devastatingly escalate its arms production. I don't think it wants to do that, though. For a variety of reasons, I don't think the United States wants to continue with this war in Ukraine, not because it couldn't. That's the important thing. I know a lot of the Xenon people say, "Oh, America couldn't. America's lost us." No, no, no. That's not the reason. It's because it's changed its priorities. America's changed its priorities and doesn't think that degrading and weakening Russia serves any long-term American national interest. I think that's what has changed. But in principle, absolutely, it can go on. It can go on fighting. It's just a matter of deciding what are America's priorities. That's not Trump's priority. Russia, Ukraine is just simply not Trump's priority. It was Biden's priority. It's not Trump's priority. That's the big change in policy. But in principle, absolutely, it can get its factories humming and producing armaments. Marx 23 says Europe says there will never be NATO troops in direct conflict with Russia. Well, what I say is never say never. I don't think it's not likely now, but in the Biden days, it was by no means a certainty. So always never say never. There's a lot of nutty people around in Europe and nutty people around in the United States who are chomping at the bit to get into some kind of a fight with Russia. And we've seen a number of these people, senior British army officers talking about a war with Russia. So it seems nutty, but just because something seems nutty doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. Just like we just said about Trump and Iran and Trump and Gaza, these are nutty ideas. Doesn't mean they're not going to happen. Anyway, Robert says, what you say about the pivot from Ukraine to the Middle East seems right and very Trumpian in the sense that Trump is all about picking fights he thinks he can win versus steering clear of those he thinks he can't. I think that's very astute, Robert. I think that he does think that if in the Middle East, Hamas, the Houthis, even Iran, he thinks Iran ultimately is a third-rate power, and it's just not in the big boy league, and therefore that's an easy one. Iran has no nuclear weapons. You can hit Iran, but ultimately Iran, all the talks about how it's going to block the Straits of Hormuz and everything else. I don't think Iran's going to do that. I mean, it's because then Iran has to go to war against the United States. Iran cannot win a war against the United States. Iran knows it cannot win the war in the United States. And the United States knows Iran knows that it can't win a war against the United States. So that's why Trump is calculating that he can intimidate Iran into acquiescence. I think that's it's. I don't know whether that's the case, but that's Trump's thinking. And I think that you're right, Robert. He thinks that, hey, that's a war we can win. Israel has been pummeling the various Arabs and coalitions of Arabs and Iranians or whatever for many years now, and has generally prevailed without too much of an effort, without really breaking too much of a sweat. And so Trump thinks, yeah, this is something we can do. It's not gonna take very much out of us. Whereas getting into a fight with Russia, that's dangerous. That's dangerous stuff. And with the outcome, by no means certain. So I think it is true, yeah, that for Trump, a conflict with Russia makes very very little sense, and he's right. Um, and Mark says the Russian economy continues to outperform Europe, UK put together. Gold. Well, it depends on how you count it. I mean, it's 40% of economy is its defense sector. That's not a desirable state of affairs when you got 40% is going on towards its defense, um, and I think Russia would very much like now to end the war economy. It's not, this is not the kind of economy it wants to run. It has serious inflation problems, has serious problems with interest rates. So, um, the idea that that he can just continue indefinite is just simply not true. And ultimately, even spending money paying all these volunteers. The people are volunteering to fight, and you have to pay them a lump sum. And this lump sum keeps getting bigger and bigger. So if you recruit, I don't know, whatever, 350,000, you need more than that, maybe 400,000 volunteers every year just to maintain your forces in Ukraine. And you have to pay each of these 400,000 a very hefty lump sum. That's an awful lot of money. And that's where you get your inflation, when you have to pay this money. So, if necessary, of course, Russia can do it. But the Russian leaders, if they have a choice, they want to bring it to an end. If there's an opportunity to bring it to an end, I think they will bring it to an end. And I think this, with Trump, may well be an opportunity. Where are we? So anyway, NKMRD says, I can imagine they toy around with the idea to send them all to Syria. EU pays the bill and getting some crazy violent proxy capacity and also for whatever Afro-European. Yeah, but it's still 2 million. That's an awful lot of people. I mean, it's just, when you're talking about those sort of population movements, and we haven't seen anything like that really since World War II. I mean, at that time everyone had become inured to terrible atrocities, and people just said, okay, well, we'll just move, a few million people from here, shove them here, or whatever. What you could do in 1946 and 47 is going to be very hard to do today. And ultimately, Egypt is not going to play ball. And if Egypt is not going to play ball, means you have to go to war with Egypt. If you go to war with Egypt, you have to go to war with Saudi Arabia. It's not a workable plan. Um, um, anyway, all right. So in DJ 5314, South Park nailed it. Blame Canada. Let's see what South Park says. Mothers against Canada. Okay, and then Anne Marie says, I left another comment. So I'm really looking forward to reading your comment on the music club. And Mark says, Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is in one of the 4 oblasts under Russian constitution. They are now part of Russia and cannot be negotiated. Nice try, Mark. I mean, all right. Everything can be negotiated. When it comes to any kind of peace settlement, it's amazing how flexible countries can be. There's something. Yes, I mean, in theory, you're absolutely right. Yes, It's a part of the Russian Federation. It's now proclaimed. Um, we'll see. We'll see what the final shape of this of this final shape of the temporary settlement. I would think Russia's going to have to give up some of those territories. They're not going to be able to get all of those 4 oblasts. They're going to say give up some of them for the sake of bringing this war to an end. I mean that Russia wants this war to end. That I think it's very important to remember. This is just simply not true. That somehow Russia can just go on fighting and fighting and fighting. They've been fighting now for more than 3 years. It's taken a huge toll. And if there's an opportunity to end the war, with Russia having accomplished some things, Russia will have accomplished some things. They've certainly accomplished more than they have accomplished in Syria, but will have accomplished some things. They will have taken most of the oblasts. NATO membership is off the table. And then maybe a few other things can be thrown in, like maintaining the rights of the Russians in Ukraine or the Russian speakers in Ukraine. I think a deal can be made. I think Russians are a sensible people, and they'll give up certain things if there's a possibility of a not bad deal to be made. And I think giving up some of the territory, whatever they have in the Constitution, you can have it in the Constitution and make a claim on the oblast, even if that territory has not been wholly incorporated within the Russian Federation. In other words, you can say, yeah, we still claim that piece of territory in the Russian Federation, but it's not under the full control of the Russian government. Ukraine's going to have to do exactly the same thing. They're going to claim that these oblasts are still a part of Ukraine, even though we don't have full jurisdiction over them. So these things can be done. We had that in Germany. It was one side claims, the West claims that East Germany is really a part of this one Germany, and that there's no real, the government of East Germany isn't really legitimate, and therefore the government of West Germany, in theory, its jurisdiction prevails throughout Germany, but in reality it didn't. So there's reality and there's aspiration. Anyway. Laura puts it very well. Inflation rates are just numbers. What matters is your pocket. Yeah, absolutely right. That's what's really important, and that's what did in Biden and the Democrats, who kept talking about how the inflation rate is so small. What matters is, what do people feel? Do people feel that they have real money in their pockets, whether they can afford things, or do they feel that that the things that they need, the absolutely essential needs, the bread, the eggs, and whatever, are beyond their abilities to pay for them? That's it. It doesn't matter what the government spokesmen say. It's entirely according to how people feel. And if people feel that this inflation is they're getting killed by it, then governments become very unpopular very, very quickly. So that's why it always makes sense. Bring your wars to an end as quickly as possible, because they can become very unpopular very quickly. Now, Laura says, for the doggies, so they don't complain about inflation. Thank you so much, Laura. Really appreciate your generosity. That's very, very, very kind of you. They do complain about inflation a lot. So that somehow the pound in their pocket, the value of their money is not taking them as far as they want, and they're not getting as much dog food for the same buck as they were before. So thank you, Laura. Anyway, my time has expired. Thank you so much, everybody who joined me. Thank you, everybody who contributed to the tip jar. That was very, very kind. I'm going to have to deal with the dogs tomorrow. Have to give an account of myself, so I have to prepare myself, mentally, to give a plausible account of myself. But thank everyone who has at least strengthened my hand in these negotiations. We're going to do some more podcasts over the weekend, and then next Monday, we hope. We're going to do our live stream with Peter, and then next Tuesday, it'll be time for my live stream solo. So thank you, everyone, for today, and good night. See you soon. All the best. Bye bye.